In 1972, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, also called the Stockholm Conference, was a landmark meeting that put global concern about the environment on the international agenda. The Stockholm Conference has since been a cornerstone of every international conference and treaty on the environment over the last 50 years. In 2021, the UN General Assembly agreed to convene an international meeting in June called Stockholm 50, A Healthy Planet for the Prosperity of All, Our Responsibility, Our Opportunity. The Royal Government of Bhutan, in collaboration with the UNDP Country Office, is currently carrying out the national stakeholder consultations to prepare for the conference. To complement this process, the Global Shapers Thimphu Hub, in collaboration with Radio Valley 99.9 FM, with support from the UNDP, brings you a 4-part series on the Stockholm 50 to highlight youth perspectives for a shared vision for a healthy and prosperous planet while accelerating progress on the SDGs and multilateral environment agreements. I welcome you to our very first episode. This episode will set the tone for the rest of the podcast series by highlighting the ongoing national level consultations, where the entire machinery of Bhutanese society and governance has been mobilized to frame the country's key message for Stockholm 50. I am your host, Namgay Choden. I'm a Foreign Service Officer and I champion climate action and youth environment at the Global Shapers Thimphu Hub. Today in the studio, I have two very special guests. I'm Azusa Kubota, the resident representative of the UNDP since March 2019, and Thinley Namgyel, now an independent consultant who has worked with the National Environment Commission for almost 20 years. Two very inspiring people. Welcome and thank you for joining us. So to start with, in your own words, I'd like to invite you to share about who you are that inspired you to do what you do. What keeps you going? What motivates you to keep staying in this space? Azusa?
Oh, thank you, Namgay. That was not the question I was expecting. That's a tough one. But I'm an SDG Sustainable Development Advocate. What keeps me going? It's the people that we touch. I very much enjoy going to communities, talking to young people, farmers, women, and really hear their stories about how climate change, other development challenges affect their lives, and how our little contribution can make their lives better. So it's the people that I meet, inspiring people at all levels. During the course of my 20 plus years of career in UNDP, climate change and environment, these are the topics that have always been at the center of all the country programs I served wherever we are. But it was actually 11 years ago when I went to the Maldives, when I saw the cabinet members, having cabinet meeting underwater, and I actually saw some island communities that are sinking into the ocean. That happened during my tenure in Solomon Islands, and when I really saw that in my own eyes, and coming here in Bhutan, looking at fast melting glacier, communities not having water source anymore, it has really become real to me, this very big concept called climate change, how real it is for ordinary people. And I think this is why I keep working in this area and being very passionate about climate change.
Right. Thank you.
Good afternoon, thank you. I think where we start is quite an interesting story. I think for me, I grew up in Bhutan, grew up here, and growing up, I think Thimphu was so small at that time. It's so different from now, So when I was growing up, it was almost like just on the edge of forest and nature. And we had backyard animals as well also. So I had this whole interaction with livestock, the kitchen garden, that sort of thing, and always had a connection with the land. And it was basically my grandmother who was growing that up, so I had that interest. And by the time I got to high school and going to college, I think the UN environment that the 1992 Rio Earth Summit came around. So there was a lot of that information coming out and that got into my interest, and is aligned with that. I was interested in studying biology and forestry actually. So I actually started as a forester, studied to be a forester, and then when I joined the civil service, I joined the Environment Commission and started off actually doing monitoring of forests, whether they were being managed sustainably, those sort of things. And then when climate change came on, I was literally just assigned the role to look after climate change. That's how I got into it. I started as a forester. But then I think over the years, started to realize that how significant this problem really was in terms of looking at it from our own perspective. Until then, we would just have all this information from the global learnings, the information that's what they're knowing outside. And when I was there, we were just starting to look at what it means in Bhutan. And then also seeing Thimphu rapidly grow so much. And then now having my own kids also, and I intend to live my whole life here in Bhutan and in Thimphu, I think we can always felt we could do things cautiously a little more better. Things have been moving so fast though, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. So that's actually what motivates me, I think. Looking to the future, looking after the place where we live, and it's basically we have to look after that.
Right. So a common thread that I see between the two of you, despite having, well, I suppose you could say very different careers at very different stages, is the fact that you've all invested so much time to translate policy into practice, whether that's at a global scale, the local scale, or even both. So that leads me to my first question, the Anthropocene and climate. So for our viewers, I'll just give a little bit of a definition about what the Anthropocene is. So it's basically an unofficial, it's unofficial for the geologist. It's an unofficial unit of time where human beings have had a significant impact on the landscape, the environment, and of course the climate. So it appears that human beings have been the problem in the sense of how we have been identified to be the definite cause for rising temperatures. So we also have to be the solution. And to this point, I would like to invite Azusa to speak on how we can come closer to the solutions that make the world a better place, and who will take these solutions forward. So in that context, why is the Stockholm 50 plus so important to this conversation globally as well as for a country like Bhutan?
Thank you. When we talk about anthropocene, again, it's an unofficial definition. It's very difficult for ordinary people to grasp what this means. One clear example of that is UNDP recently globally launched a campaign by a dinosaur who has appeared in the General Assembly Hall, telling all of us, don't let us extinct ourselves, meaning that we as humans have the capability to terminate our own existence because we are putting too much pressure on our mother planet. So this is the magnitude of the Anthropocene and how serious it is. The downside of Anthropocene we already know: pollution, environmental loss, biodiversity loss. But the upside of that is it's still not too late for us to reverse the course of action. The recent UN report has said that this is code red for humanity. Really, we're at the edge of this point of no return juncture. So what can we do about it to reverse this course of action? We recently did a global survey. So the good thing is that 80%, or almost 80% of the population surveyed said that it is important to protect the planet. So that awareness is there. But when it comes to action, only half of them said they are prepared to do something about it.
Right.
So there's a big gap between knowledge and behavior. And this Anthropocene report, Human Development Report of 2020 that UNDP launched, which focuses on Anthropocene, gives some options for us to take forward. And I really believe that it has to be a whole of society response. Climate change is such a big agenda, so complex, interconnected. It cannot be addressed by a government. Of course, government, especially local governments, play an important role in terms of regulatory framework, investing in renewable energy, giving incentives for green solutions. And I think you knows all about what needs to be done. But I do believe that the young people have a big role to play. And one of the challenges of this concept, climate change, is that I think the conversation has largely stayed amongst climate scientists and policymakers who are well educated, who understand the science. But now it's time for us to, I would call, democratize the climate agenda, meaning that the climate science needs to be understood by ordinary people. And this conversation and action have to start from bottom up. I recall that when I visited some of the communities, I learned that there's no word for climate change in Zonka.
Right.
And many people still believe, which is an asset itself, but that climate change happens because of not doing proper, windows for the deities and not much climate science behind it. And when communities understand science behind climate change, their response to disasters, preparedness improve in terms of quality. So I believe that young people can play an important role in influencing that understanding and also promoting concrete actions that can be taken at their local level to make a difference.
Right.
And Stockholm+50 is such a platform that allow young people and everybody in the community to share their vision for the future, which is green and climate proof.
Right. So I'm picking up two things that really stood out to me while you were speaking. So first is the democratization of the climate agenda, and I absolutely love that phrase. So I'm going to be following up on that in a while. But the second really was the need to humanize climate change, to bring it from a very abstract concept to something that people are experiencing in their everyday lives. So with that, coming to Aotelela, Bhutan has been recognized as a champion and a driver for climate action, but we are first already experiencing climate change, and second, we do contribute to emissions. So when I say that, it complicates the picture a little bit. And to that, I would like to ask, I would like to know if there are any sectors that we should be focusing on that have the potential to drive us to net zero.
Okay, I think that's an important question, and I think you put it in the context of we are suffering from climate change also, and also what actions we should take. And sometimes when I talk to other people also, they ask, Bhutan's already carbon neutral, should we actually do anything? And the answer is actually we should, and for a couple of reasons. First, I think just going back to, even going back to my early days of my career as a young civil servant, we would learn, like the policy papers would say, we've had far-sighted leadership for former leaders, and then also we're learning from the mistake of others. I think that used to be the mantra at that time, saying we're learning. We got late into the game, so we are learning from the past. And going over the last few decades, I'm not sure, maybe we're sort of veering off that sort of in practice. I'm finding it, putting things into practice. But there's practical reasons also I wanted to say, like why we should take action. And now when I talk to people also say, if you look, even I've actually looked at some of the policy documents, and it's actually right from the back, it was quite practical. It's more because we protect the environment not for the sake of the environment or for the sake of saying we're a good role model, but it's actually to safeguard ourselves. Right. As you said, humanizing it, right? It's actually for our own benefit, for our society's benefits, for our people's benefits. So even if you look at the Constitution, there's people that in Article 5, it says it's for the benefits, the citizens have the right and also the responsibilities to safeguard, and it's for ourselves and for future generations. So actually it's the people are at the center of it when we do any environmental action. So climate change also, and other practical reasons is actually when we take action, we're not only providing a global benefit, there's also tangible local benefits. And coming back to that in terms of why we should take action in terms of reducing emissions, we should be concerned about the impacts actually that's been caused by global changes coming from elsewhere, from over 100 years of emissions from other countries, large, rich, industrialized countries, that's now impacting us. But then we came late into the game, we're giving less. But so it's not only a rule, for example, but now the focus, I think, with new political parties is sort of economic growth. How do we create employment, actually? It's actually, we can start blending those, So if you go back to the theme of Stockholm in 1972, it also says the human environment. So it's not just the environment, it's the human environment, right? Coming back to that. And now if you go to plus 50 also, SDG, I mean Stockholm plus 50, I think the slogan says, what is it? A healthy planet for the prosperity of all, right? So again, the development aspect and the human needs comes in place also. So for us in Bhutan, coming down, it's the growing emissions where we see is from our energy consumption and from the industrial growth. And also, I think the largest contribution actually comes from the agriculture and forest sector. But it's actually not to say it's huge actually there.
Right.
It seems huge because our energy by proportion, how we produce energy is different from other countries. So we are so largely dependent on hydropower.
Right.
Our electricity generation comes from a clean source. And compared to the emissions in agriculture sector, it's actually comparable if you say per capita or per capita livestock compared to any other country in the region, whether it's Nepal or Bangladesh or India, on a per capita basis. So it's actually not that high. But because our energy production and even in the industry, the use of hydroelectricity is so high, the emission becomes relatively low and agriculture just stays up. So it seems it's high. And the where it's actually growing and coming up is actually from our transport using petrol and diesel and from the industrial growth. So those emissions going, and if we don't do anything about it, our pledge to remain carbon neutral can actually be jeopardized. We may actually hit that ceiling within a couple of decades or so. And that's not too far away actually. And the agriculture and also when the NDC was prepared, the Nationally Determined Contribution, right, which is the pledge that Bhutan put forward under the Paris Agreement, saying this is what Bhutan will do in the coming decade or so, how we will remain carbon neutral and contribute to the global effort. There were several, I think, the strategies put forward in key sectors that was done with the support of the UNDP and the NEC and the sectors who were involved. So there was one for food security, one for industry, the other ones were, human settlements, right? And then even the forestry strategy was there. And those have been designed actually as low emission development strategies, so they've been actually integrated. So how can we have industrial growth but at the same time reduce emissions? How can we have our cities grow, become better, more livable, sustainable cities and reduce emissions at the same time? So it's looking for opportunities in taking our development story forward. So really, I think a lot of people have that misnomer, like I think Madam Azusa said, getting people to understand the science, and the technical jargon in climate is also one of the biggest challenges actually. Saying we want a healthy city, livable city, we can do it. The whole global movement internationally also in terms of the under Paris is actually to bring those changes forward, and it's an opportunity for us to now, I think some say it's to get financing, climate finance to help deal with it, but it's also actually an opportunity for us to, I think, leapfrog from what we are doing now. We can do better, make our cities more sustainable, maybe make our industries more clean. And actually, the overall vision of saying, as sometimes you hear the word brand Bhutan for economic growth. So that actually goes together. So I think that's what I wanted to say. There's growing emissions in transport and industry, energy use basically, and production, economic growth, the engines. But it's actually, we can do it in a clean, green, climate-friendly manner.
Right. So to summarize, the developmental or the economic imperative doesn't necessarily have to contradict our conservation ethos and imperative as well. And so I want to connect that to what Azusa said earlier on democratizing the climate change agenda and bringing it to the grassroots, to the communities that are impacting their day-to-day. And you also mentioned the highland communities that the UNDP has recently brought a lot of attention to. So my next question is then, what are some ways in which we can not only protect but also empower these vulnerable communities, but also demographics? So I'm thinking about young people who make up almost half of the country's population today. So how do we protect but also empower them to be part of the solution? And how do we bring them into the conversation?
Well, when it comes to climate change, everybody's vulnerable, right? So we have to acknowledge that it spares no one. At the same time, it's important also to understand how differently each vulnerable group is impacted by climate change. UNDP work with NEC and the government at large on the study called Gender and Climate Change, which looked at gender differentiated experience of climate change. Unless we understand how each community is experiencing climate change differently, we will not be able to come up with targeted policy and programmatic interventions. So that knowledge base is very, very important. We cannot have a cookie cutter approach to everyone. I'm not talking about highland or mountainous or ocean, but within that micro environment, we have differentiated demographic groups that will require different responses. When it comes to young people, I fully agree with you. They have such influence. We have worked with social media influencers and artists who have incredible outreach to touch on many numbers of people. So we have always found it useful to work with young people, and it's been proven to be very, very useful. I think, like Thinley was saying, when it comes to vulnerability, we must focus on urban areas in Thimphu. Of course, we do work with farmers and remote communities, especially through our Green Climate Fund supported program on adaptation agriculture sector. That's important from food security and adaptation perspective. But if you really look at the future, immediate future for Bhutan, the biggest vulnerability lies in urban setting in Thimphu. And some of the studies that Thinley has beautifully outlined that we supported the government with clearly point out the risk of Bhutan becoming not carbon neutral by 2050 if we continue with the business as usual scenario. And this is particularly in the transportation sector. With the COVID dividend, we have seen explosion of cars, right, in Thimphu. I hear some statistics, 200% increase of number of cars and so forth. It's already congested. And although we do have a project with the government to bring in 300 electric vehicle taxis, we need much more bold solutions, investments. And this does require money. The implementation of NDC would require about 3.4 billion US dollars. And at the time of fiscal crisis for the country, for the government, and globally, these resources are very hard to come by. So where do we invest our resources? And it has to be in a high impact area. And that's definitely in the transportation sector and other energy sectors and in the urban setting. And young people, many young people have aspiration to come to live in Bhutan, so they can play an important role. I want to be a little bit more pragmatic. The young people can set example by taking electric vehicle taxis, or take bicycle. And I think there are economic incentives there apart from climate consciousness, because the oil price is going up due to various crises that we are facing globally. And we have had a massive campaign promoting city bus through an application app. And I think thanks to the work of social media influencers and so forth, taking a city bus has become a bit of a trendy thing to do amongst young people. And I do think that there's enormous scope in investing further in climate-proof infrastructure and transportation systems. And say no to plastic. And I know Bhutan has attempted so many times to ban plastic bags. I don't think it should be such a difficult thing. I was recently in Japan, and we've struggled to introduce no plastic, policy. But if you actually start charging people for plastic bags, the behavior just changes. And in the last 6 months, I'm so surprised at how quickly people's behaviors have adopted. Now everybody carries their eco bag, right? It's so simple. So just say no to plastic bag, right? Or turn off lights when they're not in use, and sort out your waste at the household level. 50% or more than 50% of waste that goes into the Thimphu Memlaka landfill is organic waste, which emits quite a bit of carbon, greenhouse gas. So can we do home composting?
Right.
It does require a little bit of effort, but gamify it, have fun, make it a competition amongst young people.
Right.
And this sort of movement is happening in other countries. You know, we gamify it, so it's actually fun to recycle, to sort out waste, and also, you know, fashion industry is also one of the biggest emitters of, you know, carbon. So, well, maybe we can recycle your grandmother's tegos and kiras. Let's see. So there are many, many small things that young people can do and create a social movement
Right.
because of their influence and just network they have. So I see a lot of opportunities to work with young people, and they can be the center, epicenter of democratization of the climate agenda.
Right. And I hope that this podcast is one way as well where we're bringing these messages to them and to open up their hearts and their minds. Oh, Thinley?
Yes, thank you. Another, I think, important element in trying to address this big challenge of, I think, climate change and also the other global challenges, especially when you talked about anthropocene earlier. I think climate change is already something that we're going to face, and the anthropocene also, we will start facing it here. I think Madam talked about the waste management. So the plastic, earlier it was actually, you know, people think it was an environmental decree. It wasn't actually, it came from the people. In the 1990s, the National Assembly, way back, the issue was brought up by some chimis, you know, at the time, the representatives of the people.
Yes.
They had some cows die in their village, I don't know where it was, and then when they actually cut it open, they found a lot of plastic bags, disposable plastic bags. So that's actually started from the bottom up.
Right.
So when you talk about democratization, I think it's key here again, it's when there's an actual direct link to how it impacts people. That's going to be, I think, key here.
Yes.
And then now, how the youth can play a role. I think Madam Azusa already gave a lot of examples, you know, using youth as, especially in fashion, new trends. That drives the whole economy, you know. And in other key countries, I think that youth fashion and trends is actually what gets picked up and goes on, you know, like the old, you have your old fashions, but the new comes up. So I think we should build on that. And then going a little further than that, I think now going into a system of democracy now, somehow I've become a little pessimistic, you know, like earlier we had bold visions in terms of whether it was for economic growth and the balance, you know, the middle path, we talked about it. But now I think because it's a political system where people have to get elected, they sort of narrowed it down to 5-year visions. It's almost as we're no longer having that long-term vision and impact, you know. And when you talk about a young person growing, you still have a lot of time ahead. And if you make plans on 5-year horizons, there's going to be repercussions on what happens, and we're not really thinking far ahead. So earlier we used to say we had far-sighted leaders. Now we're not really having that. It's sort of a myopic 5-year visions. So we have to be very careful about that. And as the youth, you said the youth is growing, right, in terms of the bulk of the population. You're the voting group. So I would say actually use that to leverage and ask when the elections are coming up also, the people who you elect, see what their platform is. See if it's looking after your interests.
Right.
Or is it just say, yes, they'll talk about jobs also, but jobs is sort of a short-term thing, and whether it's going to be sustainable, I think. Make that, I think, maybe you utilize that also. And I think the success they have in Europe and other places where they have good green policies is because they have an active population in making sure those issues are on the agenda. Because otherwise, just now, I think our decisions, 5-year decisions, are going to be made by people who have a short 5-year term horizon agenda, you know, the lobbying, whatever. So we have to mobilize the youth to make sure those important issues are heard. And I think if you look at the Paris Agreement also, you know, they learned lessons from the Kyoto Protocol.
Yes.
Kyoto Protocol had like strict rules, you know, say you have targets for this. If you don't follow this, you have these penalties,
Yes.
those sort of measures. But Paris Agreement learned saying that doesn't work.
Completely.
Again, it's a democratic process. Each country comes up with a nationally determined contribution, so it's like bottom up. Each country puts forward their action. Now, how do you hold them accountable? It's basically a name and shame.
Yes.
So there, the role of the NGOs, civil society, and the youth are important to say you're not doing your jobs. At the conferences that I've attended, you know, the youth delegation gets one slot to make a statement, and it's quite, you know, I think, really, I think struck a note when the first time I heard one of the youth delegates first came and said, "My name is, I forget the name, but I'm 17 years old. You've been negotiating more than my life. When are we going to see action?" You know, so it's like politicians will drag their feet. We have to have the youth and everybody put their feet to the fire and make sure that action takes place. Otherwise, the vulnerable, those who are in the villages, they have more urgent, pressing things. They'll be looking at that. I think as a youth, you have to look into the future and then make that agenda get a little more higher attention.
Right. And I like the allusion you drew from the Paris Agreement. It's basically do what you can.
Yes.
Do what you're capable of. So we've spoken about the need for continuity, to take good things forward, and that brings me to my final question on the future. So how has the COVID-19 created a space both in the public and the policy spheres to do things differently? We have seen it being called the positive dividends of the pandemic of COVID-19. So how has this positive dividend influenced behavior change and life patterns, which can help us reduce our emissions and help us transition into a net zero society? I'd like to invite you to go first.
I think we have seen a lot of dividends in terms of our travel patterns, which is unfortunately coming back. Now I see many people flying back,
Yes.
forth after being locked in for so long. In terms of the way we work, commuting, and so forth, we have really changed the way we work and live, definitely. But if we look at the impact of a global halt on travel, international travel, it only contributed about 6% of greenhouse gas emission reduction. So it's like a tiny drop in the ocean. But continuity, like you talked about, if the continuity is there, I think we can achieve sustainable development. When you talked about sustainable development, I thought about, okay, is this concept also understood? To me, it's all about advancing human dignity, right? Passing on a healthy planet, conducive environment to next generation, future generations. And if we don't invest in green solutions now, basically we're not enhancing the human dignity for future generations. So from that perspective, we really have to define what new normal we want to have. In terms of international travel, I said people already traveling, internationally when the skies open up. In terms of the way we work, I was recently looking at the statistics from many of the IT companies working in the US. 10%, about 10% of the companies already said they're going back to the old normal, meaning they're asking all the workforce, 100% workforce, to come back to work in office, right? The majority of them are taking a bit of a hybrid approach, so retain some sort of flexibility to work remotely and so forth, but they would have to reside within 24 hours of distance so that they could come back to the office within 24 hours and so forth. So some adjustments are made, but we as a global community, and not certainly for Bhutan, defined what this new normal looks like. And I hope this STOCKHOLM+50 will allow us to come to bottom-up consensus as to what kind of new normal we want to have for Bhutan. And when we think critically about the new normalcy, data is so important. I have talked about the challenges of democratizing climate science, but at the end of the day, if we don't have credible real-time data for policymakers to rely on, we won't be able to make informed decisions. And my concern is that because of the enormous pressure, physical pressure on governments and institutions, we might have this tendency to say no to studies and assessments. With technology, we don't always have to have expensive surveys. I think, frankly, we have to do data collection and analytics very differently now with technology and our sort of adaptation to some of the online ways of working and collecting data. So in order to make bold decisions, we have to build on robust data analytics, and I hope Bhutan would invest in some of the new ways of continuously analyzing and updating climate data to see how we can adapt to the new normal. And I also hope that many cities and the countries around the world have made bold pledges as part of green recovery from the COVID in the form of completely going EV in the transportation sector and so forth. Bhutan, of course, has certain targets in the NDC, but for example, city like Thimphu hasn't come up with a clear target, right? I think it's a good sign of commitment and faith to establish certain collectively, of course, defined targets to mobilize, the mass movement and support, so that we have a clear definition as to what our new green and inclusive and sustainable normal will look like. And I very much look forward to something like that coming out in the near future.
Right. Totally.
Yes, I think now, hopefully, we're coming out of the pandemic, right? And to look at this in terms of the COVID dividend and how we move forward, I think maybe you can draw on the experience that we've had over the last 2 years in terms of our lockdowns and the efforts that Bhutan as a country put in. And I think I wanted to say, during the first lockdowns and trying to make sure it didn't spread, I think we were lauded as a good example of working together. The people came to cooperated, we had good leadership, those sort of things. That's one important lesson, I think. So if we put our heads together, our hearts together, and we can come together, we can achieve great things. But over time, then, as it moved along, as I wanted to highlight also the lessons as we moved up with the health and safety first thing. But COVID itself was also not taking place in a vacuum. It's a multidimensional problem. There's socioeconomic issues. I think towards the end of, this beginning of this year and end of last year, we started hearing those creaks coming in and the voices of desperation from the most vulnerable, especially in the urban areas and those who are dependent, can't really work from home, those sort of things. So it's a multi-dimensional problem. Similarly, I think climate change is that way. So we adapted and we started lifting. Once we all were triple vaccinated or the kids started getting vaccinated, we adapted and moved on. So we need to do that as well. And I think similarly for climate change also, we need to push that. There's lessons from there. And now governments everywhere, even for us also, it's going to be now, how do we build back? The economy needs to come back, right? There's going to be a lot of investments, a lot of push from the government, from the different private sector. The donors will have that interest also. So it's an opportunity, I think. Can we really integrate, building back better? So it's not just building back, can we integrate it? So if we build back the cities, build back the economy, can we actually do something better? And I think if we say we really learn from what others are doing, the Europeans, the Americans, they're trying to integrate into the big infrastructure bills. Others, the Europeans had also plans saying they are preparing now for different shocks, like say the biological shock, which is the pandemic, the ecological shock, which is climate, then the economic shocks, and also now moving into a digital world. So their big investments that they're going for the next 10 to 30 years is going to think that, integrate all that. Can we actually do it? Bhutan, I think, started on the 21st century roadmap. I'm not sure where that is, where it's gone, but I think the focus was there, from what I can gather from the little information I got, was on raising per capita income. Hopefully, those biological shocks, ecological shocks, which are realities that will impact whatever investments we make. We want to build more bridges, dams, industries. They will be vulnerable. And also, we invested in, make sure the investment is wise, was wise. We can actually make sure we put in the latest technologies, actually make the right choices. Are we really going to go organic and build on that and build that industry? Or do we just want more mines and those sort of things? So actually building it back better is important. And some of the lessons, I think, bring a reality check again. For me, just sitting, observing now, Thimphu had a structural plan that was done quite some time back. We had green buffer zones. But now if you look at it, what happened during the pandemic, they were trying to build back. A lot of infrastructure got put in place. But they all got put in the green buffer zones. And people, I think, don't realize when they say green, they think, it's for the environment. Actually, they're missing out the key term, buffer. It's actually a water buffer, where the rivers flowing, where the streams are flowing. So during times of flooding, they flood. It's a buffer, so it's to keep the shocks from going beyond. So it's actually to absorb that. But unfortunately, I think over the last year or two, we've actually built a lot of infrastructure there, whether it's vegetable sheds or other things in there. So, and actually, if you think about it, building back better, like in the UK and other places, they said we need to make social distancing important now with the new diseases. So they said, let's start investing in sidewalks, make our sidewalks better. So public commuting is much better, right? So those sort of synergies is really important. And here, actually, our buffers could have been, like I think the Dutch, who have been dealing with flooding and sea walls and those sort of things for almost centuries. I think they said, we let the rivers breathe. We have a buffer. They flood in there. During normal times, we use that as recreation, green spaces, actually. So the key word is the buffer is the first thing. Other benefits is actually how we integrate. So when we build I hear there's moves to sort of rethink the structure plan of Thimphu and also from the whole Thimphu Valley to Paro Valley as a national capital region. We have to put those ideas in, and as we build back better, we have to think of the future, what impacts are going to happen, are social economic growth going to be the same, and optimize and find those synergies, I think. So
Right.
I think the biggest dividend we can probably reap is if we actually take action, and if not, it's going to be, I think, another lost opportunity.
Well, it certainly calls for many difficult conversations through all stratas of society, and I'm glad that we could start one, hopefully, here today. I thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed listening and learning from the two of you. And for our viewers, do continue to tune in. We will be bringing you 3 more episodes where we invite relevant and impactful youth voices to talk about the Stockholm Plus 50. Thank you for your time.